مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بدأ العام الجديد بخطاب لوزير الخارجية بومبيو ألقاه في القاهرة، وهي المدينة نفسها التي ألقى فيها باراك أوباما أول خطاباته الكبرى قبل ما يقرب من 10 أعوام بالتمام والكمال. ولكن فيما أدى المكان اختلفت موضوعات الخطابين اختلافان تماما. أكد أوباما التواصل مع العالم الإسلامي، واختفى بومبيو بأمريكا كقوة للخير. رغم الاختلافات الواضحة إلا أن هناك بعض الطرق التي تتشابه بها إدارتا أوباما وترامب أكثر مما تختلفان، وأقصد بذلك الإقدام ربما عن التدخل في سوريا لمناقشة أوجه الاختلافات بين ترامب وأوباما والقواسم المشتركة. يسرني أن أرحب بلجنتنا التي تضم خبيري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Since we last met with our panel of foreign policy experts, a lot of foreign policy has happened. President Trump ordered the withdrawal of American forces from Syria. The Secretary of Defense and the special envoy to the counter-ISIS campaign both resigned in protest. Secretary Pompeo went to the Middle East to make America's case. And then there's everything else in the world, such as the confrontation in Venezuela. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Denis Ross and Juan Zarate to help make sense of all of this. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today.
Thank you.
So let's start with Syria. President Trump ran on a campaign of getting out of America's forever wars. Is it really a surprise that he decided to pull American troops out of Syria? Denis?
No, I don't think it's a surprise. If you go back and look not only what he said in the campaign, if you look what he said 6 months ago at a campaign rally in Ohio, he was consistent. I think he was talked out of pulling out the forces earlier, but clearly this was something that he was inclined to do from the very beginning. Again, you go back to the campaign, he said Assad's not a good guy, but why do we care? And he said if the Russians want to be there, it's fine. I mean, the problem, of course, is that you had the Syrian Democratic Forces, largely Kurdish-led, but also with Arab participants as well, who did the fighting largely on the ground for us against ISIS. We were committed to them, it seemed. Certainly the Pentagon and Mattis and people in the Pentagon felt strongly about them as partners, and yet we were prepared, the president was prepared to walk away with no notice. I mean, none of our friends in the region were told in advance. So A, it shouldn't be a surprise, but B, it has a consequence, and I think it has a consequence in terms of creating more of a vacuum within Syria, creating more uncertainty there, creating, in my mind, a greater potential for a conflict between the Israelis and the Iranians, which I think is already moving to a new level, and raising questions in the minds of America's friends in the region. Is the U.S. really going to remain in the region?
Well, that's a bit of an indictment. Juan, is this really a decision that happened in a phone chat between the president and the president of Turkey, and with all of America's senior advisors being kept in the dark?
It seems like it, Rob, but as Denis mentions, I think this follows the instinct and the commitment that the president has had all along to not have an American military presence in the Middle East. We've also seen this in the debate around Afghanistan, whether or not the president has really been fully committed to having a long-term American presence with military forces on the ground. And so the moment was surprising, and I think it happened the way it's been described, which is in the wake or during this conversation with President Erdogan of Turkey. But I think it has been a long time in coming. And what it reveals is a real fracture of American policy, which is dangerous for many of the reasons Denis has said. But it suggests that the president was never fully committed to the policy goals that had been articulated by the former Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the entire foreign policy apparatus, which was we were on the ground fighting and supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces not just to fight ISIS and not just to reclaim territory, but also to deal with Iranian aggression and designs in the region, also to give us leverage in resolving what would happen ultimately in Syria, and a whole range of other effects that American military presence on the ground gives us. And I think it also demonstrates the president hasn't fully sort of grasped or been willing to accept the second and third order effects of simply absenting the U.S. from the region. That is to say, abandoning allies and what that means in terms of messaging around the world, not just to the Kurds, leaving the fight maybe to the Turks, and what that means in terms of division of labor and shared responsibility in the region, or even going so far as to say, Iran and Russia can do what they want in the region with all of the implications that that brings. And so it's a disturbing moment because it does call into question both U.S. policy and U.S. commitment, and whether or not the president really understands and realizes the second and third order effects of this kind of a moment.
I mean, look, I think people can have a reasonable debate about the wisdom of 2,000 troops, northeastern Syria, right, strategic advantage, disadvantage, but both of you served at high levels of government. What does it mean when commitments made publicly by the Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, et cetera, are ripped up overnight by the President of the United States? American troops won't leave this country until Iran leaves this country. What does that mean in practice?
It means a couple of different things. And to be fair, it's not unique to this administration, although this administration does seem particularly dysfunctional, at least at one level. I don't know of another administration that I can recall where you basically put your Secretary of State, your Secretary of Defense, your National Security Advisor in a position where whomever they may meet internationally, no one can really be sure is what they're hearing from that senior American official actually authoritative. Does it really reflect what America's foreign policy will be? Because basically it looks like the president at any moment can undercut them. The timing of this particular decision, it came 2 days after his envoy for Syria had made a statement identifying the 3 conditions that had to be met before we would withdraw. One related obviously to the defeat of ISIS but ensuring it couldn't recoup. Another related to countering and ensuring that the Iranians would leave Syria. And the last related to producing a real political process, a credible political process in Syria to produce some kind of real change politically in that country. And then 2 days later, we're leaving without any of those conditions. The fact that the National Security Advisor had said 6 weeks before, we're not getting out until the Iranians get out, it becomes clear whatever senior American officials are saying isn't necessarily something you can count on. I think that raises also a very practical question. Yes, there's a larger strategic question of can you count on America's word writ large? But there's also the question of when you're dealing with American officials on a day-to-day basis, what are you supposed to take from those conversations? How reliable are those conversations? And how do you plan policy? I think there's a bigger question here. It's not just a question of American reliability. What are the choices that other countries feel they have to make when they're in a circumstance where they're really not sure what the United States will do?
I think that it does raise all of that, and I want to underscore the strategic implications because I think it begins to raise the question of what is the intent of U.S. interaction with the world? What is the intent of what the Secretary of State may be saying or the Secretary of Defense? Is this simply a transactional foreign policy, which seems to be affected by short-term implications or factors, which seems to be what the president ultimately does with his instinctual policy decisions? Or is there a broader design for the exertion of American power in a different way, with a basis on sovereignty, with the assertion that America is a force for good, as we saw in Secretary Pompeo's speech in Cairo? How do those two messages and interactions with the world actually mesh? And I think what we're seeing is a bit of confusion or maybe even balkanization of how people interpret this. It's interpreted in certain ways in places like South Korea, where they have seen mixed messages. It's interpreted in different ways in the Middle East. Latin America, it's seen differently. So it creates confusion, not just as to who can speak for the United States, but what is the United States actually intending to do in the world broadly and in these regions.
Well, let me pursue this for a moment, Juan. When Secretary of Defense Mattis resigned, his resignation letter was not focused just solely on the Syria decision. He said that the president deserves to have a Secretary of Defense better aligned with his own views, which suggests that there are a broad array of issues on which there was some measure of disagreement.
Yeah.
Was it beyond just the Syria decision?
I think that's right, and I think the undercurrent here, and the Syria decision I think was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back here, but I think what I read from the resignation letter was a concern that the Secretary had that his views with respect to commitments to alliances, the nature of security relationship with key allies or key counterparties did not align with the president's view. And I think, frankly, it was fairly obvious that that was the case. But I think in terms of policy, what Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo, the former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster were able to do was to align a view of further commitment to NATO, further commitment to key alliances in the Middle East, realignment and further commitment, for example, to Israel, all these things, meshing that with the president's message. I think this Syria moment was a rupture in that ability to say we are actually demonstrating our commitment to these alliances in a way that was comfortable for Secretary Mattis and that didn't ultimately conflict with the president. This was a moment of conflict in those views, and I think that's why you saw the resignation and the resignation letter the way it was crafted.
Yeah, no, I largely agree with that. I would take it one step further, at least in terms of looking, is there some kind of conceptual principle that guides the president internationally? And does it have any kind of roots in the American historical tradition? And my answer is yes on both counts. The concept that he articulated, if you go back to his original speech, initial speech at the UN in 2017, was state sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And the idea of state sovereignty is every state gets to do what it wants to do, it pursues what its interests are. The reason that'll be okay is because it's not really in their interest to have conflict. The problem is that ignores the reality that there's a lot of states that basically have predatory instincts. And sometimes they may be predatory instincts driven by some kind of defensive self-perception that they want to push threats farther away. Nonetheless, they seek advantage, they seek control, and if you don't have a rules-based system, then there's nothing to govern that, and there's vacuums that are created, and they're going to go ahead and fill those vacuums. And that's what's happening now. Where you see the roots of this, there is a deep strain, although it's traditionally been a minority strain, there's a deep strain of unilateralism, that the U.S. shouldn't be bound by anything else. The U.S. should be able to have complete freedom of action. International institutions are not something that really attract us. Alliances are obligations that we bear. They're not really something that add to our strength and our power. And I think what you see in President Trump is a unilateralist instinct. He wants complete freedom of action. He wants to be able to do a deal with anybody, traditional friend or traditional foe. He doesn't want to be bound by that. Values play no place in his foreign policy because everything is pretty much a transaction. So it's not that it's unique to the American tradition, but it's never been in the mainstream of the American tradition.
All right, fascinating. When we come back after the break, we're going to ask whether in all of this, is there any similarity between our current president and his predecessor, Barack Obama, especially as regards Syria? In just a moment. All right, gentlemen. Secretary of State Pompeo went to Cairo to give a speech that was the anti-Barack Obama speech. We are not Barack Obama. Times have changed. But let's take a look at Barack Obama and Donald Trump on Syria. Reluctance to engage, reluctance to invest military force, get me out of America's forever wars. Is there some similarity here, or am I making it up? Dennis?
No, I actually think we have a great deal of continuity in terms of the approach. First of all, the Trump administration pretty much inherited and applied, maybe with some greater intensity, maybe with greater freedom of action for decision making as it related to American forces, but pretty much continued to support what was the force that the Obama administration was supporting on the ground in Syria to fight ISIS. The overall approach was pretty much the same. The desire to keep things, I think, limited with and avoid what might be described as mission creep was very much the same. Obama never wanted what we were doing in Syria to be seen as anti-Iranian. And the fact is, even though the words of the administration from everybody but Trump was focused on an anti-Iranian part of the mission, he never bought onto that. He said repeatedly, we're only in Syria for ISIS. And then he claimed since we've defeated them, we can get out. The basic approach towards Syria is extremely similar.
I think that's right. I think the rhetoric, especially on the counterterrorism side, is reminiscent of 2011 in Iraq, where Barack Obama had promised to get U.S. troops out of Iraq and was very clear about that and went forward. And critics of the Obama administration would say left precipitously, left without enough thinking about how to further influence what was happening in Baghdad, left us blind to the rise of ISIS and led to the growth of the caliphate. And so I think Dennis is right. I think the one area where the administration and Secretary Pompeo in particular, you see it in the speech, would push back is to say, we've been willing to exert force and exert power where the prior administration was not willing to. So for example, with the use of chemical weapons, the U.S. was willing to fire missiles back to send a message to Assad and to constrain that behavior. And so I think there are dimensions of the use of power, including more boots on the ground in Syria than the prior administration had, those kinds of things, where the Trump administration would point to as a point of distinction. The real problem here, though, and you look at the Cairo speech, is Secretary Pompeo trying to lay out a theory of the case of American influence, America being a force for good, American commitment to the region, when you have a president that at the same time is withdrawing troops from Syria without having a clear articulation of what his theory of the case is as president. And so you really have, I think, Secretary Pompeo trying to lead the president to water here, to be further committed and to not commit the same mistakes and sins of the past. And what you see in the Cairo speech is really an attempt to have a theory of the case and really to argue that America not only is a force for good, but is the only good alternative to the rest of the forces in the world. He compares American force and influence to Iran. He asks the question, would China and Russia have liberated Kuwait in the face of aggression from Saddam Hussein? And so it's really an articulation for America's place in the Middle East. The problem is it comes at a time when the president seems to be retreating.
Also, can I just add one point? Yes. There's such a huge gap between what Secretary Pompeo was laying out in terms of our objectives and the means that we're prepared to apply to them. He talked about how we're going to remove 130,000 Hezbollah rockets from Lebanon. He talked about how we're going to get all the Iranians out of Syria. Each might be a desirable objective, but what are the means that we're prepared to apply? I mean, there's an ocean in terms of a gap between what he says we're going to seek to do and what we seem prepared to do in terms of means that we will apply to achieve it.
So we have less than a minute left, but I did want to at least ask you about the other sort of imagery of the last period of time, which is the president getting America more deeply engaged in an active confrontation closer to home, Venezuela. Pulling out, as we talked about, pulling out of Syria, pulling out of lessening our engagement further away, but throwing us into the thick of a confrontation in the Western Hemisphere. How do you decipher this, Juan?
Two quick thoughts, and interesting in the context of Syria. We have a moment where the U.S. is recognizing the legitimacy of an alternate leader, Juan Guaido, claiming Maduro as illegitimate, raising the ghosts of Syria, right? When we claimed Assad was illegitimate, and then what happened next, is now history. But there's an interesting question: what does the U.S. do actually to support a legitimate leader in their eyes, and what do you do to depose an illegitimate leader? What does that regime change look like? We're now at that moment. The second thing is, the president says all options are on the table, and we could have a moment of flashpoint that forces a question of whether or not the U.S. will actually use force, at a minimum to protect its diplomatic personnel, but also maybe even to force that change. That's a very real possibility, much more so today than just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the administration has fully thought through the implications of what they're saying. If there is a distinction, though, it could well be it's a Western Hemisphere, and you could see a reemergence of kind of the Monroe Doctrine, especially with the Russians suddenly saying, warning us not to do this. This may be a moment for this president to try to show that he has a somewhat different posture towards the Russians than everybody seems to think.
And it's interesting that the Russians, the Chinese, and the Turks have come out in support of Maduro. So it creates a broad geopolitical framework for what happens next in Caracas.
Absolutely fascinating. One can't imagine that in the 21st century, the world will bifurcate what happens just in our part of the globe with what is happening everywhere else. So thank you, gentlemen, for helping to explain this, and I look forward to having you back to decipher what's going to be happening in the weeks ahead.
Thank you.
I can see a lot of museums, like not only with the ancient things, they are like museums for literature and all those things. I like the place. It's very helpful for the students to get educated by going to the museum.
President Trump's decision to declare victory over the Islamic State and withdraw U.S. ground forces from northeastern Syria may be the right move. He certainly ran his campaign on a promise to bring the troops home and to end what he has called America's forever wars. And it's tough to argue that the small number in Syria, just 2,000, was big enough to change the strategic balance there, though it was certainly big enough to be a target for America's enemies. Maybe bringing the troops home is smart, especially if U.S. air power can sustain a no-fly zone in the region that provides the same benefits of the ground presence at much less risk to the American troops. But in a certain sense, that's not really the point. Yes, in my reading of the Constitution, the president, as commander-in-chief, has the unfettered authority to deploy and withdraw U.S. troops according to his assessment of the national interest. But what are our friends and our adversaries supposed to make of the public commitments made by the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and National Security Advisor that U.S. troops would remain in Syria for the foreseeable future, that their presence was essential to the protection of local allies who fought, bled, and died along our troops to defeat the Islamic State, and that U.S. forces would only leave when Iran's Foreign Legion, hundreds of miles from Iranian territory, left the blood-soaked land of Syria too. The times we live in are perilous enough, when neither foreign leaders nor the American people can count on the fact that the words of our most senior foreign policy leaders reflect the view of the president they serve. Uncertainty reigns, only adding to the perils of our age. So my plea today is not for the administration to change its mind on the question of military deployment in Syria, or to change any other specific policy it has in the Middle East or elsewhere around the world. Rather, my plea today is for something more basic, more fundamental. Mr. President, fix the system. Draw on the wise counsel of your advisors. Make a decision. Explain it to the American people and to our friends around the world. Have our government speak with one clear voice. And don't raise doubt about the trust in which we hold public servants, whose words and deeds could affect the security of millions. After all, as the saying goes, trust takes years to build, seconds to break, and forever to repair. And in the internet age, we don't have forever. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول الانسحاب الأمريكي من سوريا، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم، شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.